Hello everyone, today we talk about the peace and truce of God in the 10th, 11th century, introducing the topic really which never addressed before, oddly enough, given that we talk often about post-Carolingian Europe and also we have a military bias, as you know, and that is quite relevant to lots of topics we're touching today. Yesterday we were talking about the military stabilization of the Magyar Slavic frontier at the hands of the Eastern Franks as a major, actually, in fact, further stabilizer in post-Carolingian Europe. Recently also we commented on whether, in the history of civilization, war is made more or less, or at least what are the conditions that bring to necessity of making less war or regulating it in a way that is, still politically viable, but for the more profitable reasons. And so the peace and truce of God are, and never switch the order there, because actually the peace preceded the truce in the, as we will see in the ecclesiastical practice, is exactly a good example of this topic, because it was fundamentally the response from the elites, but not only the community as a whole, to a state of endemic warfare, right? Something that was not dramatically far from what had been seen before, let's say, but still in presence of a hierarchy that seemed to have, in fact, had lost capacity to bring order and control, and that therefore required the local communities to self-regulate in these matters. And let's say, from all what we have talked about in post-Carolingian Europe, we see how in this high medieval reality the life of the population, especially in the areas of Carolingian, former Carolingian government, took place within an extraordinarily complex net of seigneurial preponderances that in fact have nothing to do with the old historiographical interpretational pattern that at this point is surpassed really in history books, but still is somehow present at some, in fact, levels of popular imagery of the Middle Ages. That is to say, a stratified feudal hierarchy by evidently distinguishable levels, right, properly of the hierarchy itself, and a power social hierarchy among the various nuclei in which the lay and ecclesiastical aristocracy had been articulating after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire undoubtedly existed, right? But every nucleus was actually made up of, say, elements that were connected politically, militarily, and social variously with each other, right? And even here, the establishment of a seigneurial system that we have seen also a bit schematically in multiple videos is was really present next to other types of components, of which the Vassalatic-Beneficiary institution was just one of them. And it was in rather free modification with virtue of contracts and successions, customs, and violence itself, in fact. And in spite of being naturally, however, still very important, as we have seen, for the bonds of associations, both personal and real, that is expressed as an order, and especially for the growing use that after the year 1000 roughly was made of it in the attempts of, in fact, political and territorial recomposition. So, from a general look at the 10th and the 11th century, it's not surprising to think how the say, the base of local seigniories was still in theory, and the seigneurial transactions and the vassalatic bonds still very unsatisfactory to define the coexistence of many armed groups. And in order for us to essentially delineate clearly anarchic pictures in many regions, right? And this is in part a mistake, because anarchy is often used for this. There are times in history that are, in fact, historiographically properly known as it was a phase of anarchy altogether. Well, anarchy is like, what does it really mean, right? There is some lack of arche, there is some lack of top of authority, etc. Yes, this is true, but still, in every community, somebody rules, right? And if you look with greater care, the smaller scale, the same one of the seigniories actually operated, you're lucky enough to document it in some areas, you realize that what they were doing was actually extremely logical and rational. That it wasn't anything, let's say, particularly, let's say, incomprehensible or at least irresponsible about what we're doing practically. It is true, of course, that this proclivity to violence brought to the fueling of feuds in general that were also kind of emotionally driven. Yes, we're talking here about still the definition, in fact, of the order that we know later, like in the feudal era. This, as we'll see now, is also properly the moment of definition of a military class. The milites, as we know them in a medieval sense. So, properly, we're looking at this eminent members of the community that detained goods, heavy arms, and war horses that were aimed properly at fighting on a regular basis. For these people, really all their lives, and the rest of the community fundamentally working for them to provide exactly for those means that were, for the same community, the means of protection for themselves, right? And this also have explained many times that the establishment of feudalism wasn't really much of a blackmail, but actually a necessity. In a moment such, in fact, the 10th century, where the public order was collapsing, and it had never quite been even particularly favorable to the average freeman. I mean, those times were over, right? The seigniories existed from much before, especially in Post-Carolingian, say even in pre-Carolingian Europe. We can easily say in the Merovingian world. Much of what the Carolingians developed further was actually already there, present in Nuta, if not properly in act, in terms of even the mounted combat, even though less developed, but fundamentally this idea of feudal, this idea of lordship, right, of great landowners that owned enormous estates and with lots of people that just work for them there. In Gaul especially, this had never changed from Roman times. We have explained many times the main differences between the Western, let's say, Latin Germanic countries, post-Roman countries, how, let's say, some regions in Europe saw the continuity with the Roman latifundium, mostly Gaul and Spain, whereas Italy or Britain actually saw a collapse of the system. And so different models of it. And especially in the first model, there was naturally a tendency to it, what in fact we know as the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, because fewer people had remained in control of larger amount of other people. When we say land, we're actually talking about people, because if you have land but you have nobody who works on it, right, you really have nothing. And the intensification, think about the second invasions, just yesterday we were talking about them, the Magyars, the Normans, the Saracens, and how their incursions brought to a further militarization of the country. We have seen how the encapsulation spread in these centuries that is usually connected, say, oh no, because the Vikings arrived, they began to raid everywhere, they began to build castles. This is not really the case. I mean, in some areas, the invaders surely brought to the necessity of more political cohesion, and even fortification in that sense reflected that. But largely speaking, let's say, yeah, there were many raids, but if you look at the single places locally, like, maybe these places were raided twice in 200 years. Like, they and by these foreign invaders, whereas the local lords would fight on a much regular basis. In fact, what actually we get archaeologically from encastration is that the majority of castles that were built, I mean, we're talking about, something very primitive still, that, and especially in that case, because it turns out that whenever they were built for the foreign invaders that came every once in a while, they were built in places that basically were aimed just at stopping that invasion. They didn't make a policy power, so they were smaller fortresses that would be abandoned later. The majority of fortresses and places were actually instead in areas where it was the lords who were building those castles to rule over the rest of the population, and that's basically what most of encastration was actually about. And of course, in competition with the lords that were next door, right? Because post-Carolingian Europe was built like that. It was essentially this enormous thing from Brittany to Benevent, from Barcelona to the Elbe, all covered in these districts, differing in some ways according to the countries, but let's say governed ideally by the local count or whoever was powerful enough there, and we're talking about hundreds of them, if not more. And so that was effectively what Europe was. There's an enormous an enormous number of seigneuries that were that small, and were mostly, in fact, based on that kind of, in fact, local scale at the beginning, especially when properly the more powerful one began to extend their seigneuries over many others at the same time. It's still in a very, as you know, as the feudal system would be, in a decentralized way, with the further necessity of, in fact, consolidating properly the local rule in a way, surely building ever greater castles in more strategic locations, so that they could dominate a larger area without having to fortify it in the process altogether. But mostly, right, even just for the pick what royal power was at this point, was very limited, right? Kings, even emperors at this point, didn't factually control directly just a couple of provinces, if they were lucky, right? The rest was just kind of a political influence that was mostly supported by, in fact, by the local population. So this was, as you understand, a moment of great, territorial adjustment, to say the least. And it's obvious that this passed in great part of politics, but also often through war. And so that military class that we were talking about before emerged exactly within this context. I mean, that was as necessary as the political compaction that they were carrying out, and it was effective. So talking about anarchy, about that, given that it is true, there was no strong authority above, right? Because royal, even imperial power fundamentally were a small thing, especially for the maintenance of a long-lasting control on larger territories. There was no other way but for the local communities to take matters in their own hands, and to also functionalize in this extremely competitive reality where really everybody was always threatened, right? You couldn't really sit there and say, okay, let's be peaceful, right? Because if you were peaceful, you basically gave up the initiative to other people who would just, do everything possible to essentially take over your power. And so the only way to stay afloat was to participate in the game. And if you had lived at the time, even if you had been a victim of the violences that followed, it would be crystal clear to you what was the reason that had brought to that, right? Not that you had to command it, but I mean, the logic was so obvious that nobody was surprised about that. And this is not to say that, of course, violence was commended. In fact, this is the important side of the story, that it's not about violence per se, it's about the reason of violence. Right, that's what civilization is always taught to. It's not violence is not nor positive nor negative by itself. Right, whoever attaches a moral value to violence per se is an idiot. Right, you can make the point that violence, most of the cases, is not the best option on the table. But if you think that it must not be on the table, it's even not on the table, you're just an idiot. Yes, and you're more likely not just the one who's going to be taken over by people who know how to use violence, but also one who would actually more easily recur to a very irrational and emotionalistically driven form of violence that will eventually succumb, right? Will cause a disaster and further reasons to create, to be able to be effectively violent, to put down people like you. And that's, in fact, the disgusting nature of pacifism. That is one of the most radically violent, stupid, and fascistic ideologies that humans have ever conceived. Now, that's another topic we were commenting on recently. That is to say, we tend also we have this dark bias about the Middle Ages. That is to say, it's mostly an atmospheric thing. It's like those documentaries you find even on YouTube, etc. Whatever. The Middle Ages is just a bunch of dirty people living in a gloomy reality, in utter poverty. That's basically the Middle Ages, right? Even assuming that was like the gloominess depends on the weather, right? There is, as we know, kind of a more Northwestern European bias to the narrative of the Middle Ages in popular culture, but it's not the point. The point is that at the end of the day, these shows really tell you, well, yeah, let's see how these people lived, how was life really like, in early medieval whatever. This deep mystery, it's so complicated, we have to sort it out. It's a big problem that nobody ever wrote anything about, right? And it's so different, or in nature, from the Middle Ages, from the ancient world to the modern age, right? It must be something specific, essential and unique about that. And it's mostly like showing these peasants plowing the land and how they made clothes. Right? What actually escapes the actual picture that is also kind of the attached to the negative bias of the Middle Ages, is that yes, there were a lot of wars, right? But what actually is shown in popular culture, yes, some guy arrives on horseback making rah rah with a sword and killing a bunch of people, and then and it doesn't explain you anything of that, right? It also shows that in a completely modernistic and fortunately much more pacific-minded background like the one that we have in our culture, as if look, the asshole has arrived, he's killing a bunch of innocent people, right? And went away. It's just a calamity. It's as if now a tornado arrives, or a storm, or a flood, this is just a guy on horseback killing people, and has completely. This is a product naturally of our complete civic illiteracy and deresponsibilization that has occurred civilization in the last generations in an utterly disgusting way, for people to relativize basically every single thing, not even understanding the most elementary political realities, and distorting them ideologically for whatever wisdom and complex they have in mind. But what we have truly forgotten, even just compared to the generation of our grandparents, frankly, and even the attitude that was there. I mean, pick World War I. It was absolutely normal at the time to think something, yeah, I will die for my own country, right? It was absolutely normal. Everybody believed that. It was actually a duty. It was something to be proud of. Now, today, we was really willing to die for any cause in the first place. That tells you how low we have fallen. Like, not that, those people actually had a clearer understanding, like, because they fought, I don't know, in the World War I or World War II, they had any idea of what actually happened from an historical point of view. Absolutely. But I mean, their attitude, their habituation to to the idea of picking a gun and going to shoot people, get shot in the process, was kind of there. So you can imagine what it was actually like in the 10th and 11th century. There are also those conservative perspectives say, no, this was the High Middle Ages was the moment of the great perfection of tradition, of true values. People were so well-spirited. They were just, they were so much better than us. I don't know if you ever read, medieval chronicles in general, but and also without the bias that you have been fed with the chronicle being some kind of invention, right? As if other sources were, instead pure reality, and the chronicle just per se, because it's narrative, it has to be wrong, right? That just, if anything, tells you how distant you are from having, in fact, not having read anything about medieval sources in the first place. But try to read what was written, right? Maybe at this time, it was kind of difficult to get info rather than getting them wrong. But, the info that you get are pretty remarkable. And the sheer scale of violence is something psychologically devastating. I mean, it's unbelievable, even that it would be normal to live in such a reality. Because you see, violence is not even, how much violence you physically suffer. It's just even the possibility of the fact that violence can be witnessed, right? Not by you in general, even if indirectly, but just for the fact that you have to run away at some point because somebody's going to come and destroy you, or you have to always be prepared to know how to handle a weapon, to be ready to leave your houses and take refuge in the lordly moat or something, and facing famines, scarcity, epidemics. It's something that just people had a completely different view of life in the first place. And this is something that, as an experiment, you can do. If you ever stop thinking for a moment, like, imagine we have witnessed, imagine there is a much more devastating pandemic than this one. It really kills, a person out of 3, or a nuclear war. Well, just think at that point, how immediately, even thinking about that, what are the things that your brain gets to that it feels you must do in order to survive? Like, you're literally thinking immediately in a completely different pattern from your normal habit, knowing where to get water, knowing where to get food, how to get it, the fact that there are other people that you would have to kill them, right? All these things can happen literally from a day to another in a real situation, because that's what we are genetically programmed for. And in those times, these events, especially in certain areas, were dramatically on the floor, dramatically evident, right? The crop rate was ridiculous. People basically lived just out of, with subsistence, survival rate, economies fundamentally. I made several videos also on this, how this affected, in fact, the same formation of the seigneury, because it was important to have somebody, again, in arms that kept safe the reserves, that could, host you within some fence, some fortification, because what would be the single individual could be easily at safety without those infrastructural capacity. Would it have them, right? So also that's why this wasn't really an anarchy, but actually a strong concentration of power in the process, right? Anarchy would have been mostly something like how freemen lived out there in the wild. And there is a huge debate on whether actually people lived better in absolute terms when they were under, the full burden of the feudal regime, or let's say in the early Middle Ages, because people said, well, in the early Middle Ages, we see they had a better diet, they ate more fat and proteins. Yeah, but how, what would still the cost of that, right? How which factors are you taking into account? Is a simply materialistic, economistic thing, or actually a mental one, that is what people live under fundamentally? Because it doesn't turn out to be that the Ancien regime, brought to a decline of civilization. People may have lost power in relative terms, but in absolute terms, they kind of lived better, or at least even when this didn't happen, the majority of people kind of did live better than in previous one, right? The early Middle Ages might have been freer in that sense, but did people live better than in the later ones, even when they were under kind of a larger feudal power? It's very hard to tell, right? And actually, I would say without too much hypocrisy that no, people lived much better later than before, right? So, and I think this period in post-Carolingian times is the proof of it, because exactly in the moment of anarchy, what happens is that there is a dramatic search for, political recomposition and even alienating your own personal freedom in order to survive in the first place, which, if that's really the deal, it's kind of understandable in some ways. And what is important to stress in this picture is that the world still, you see, this is the beginning of what we call the feudalism per se. This was not a moment where the military class, the knights, really dominated everywhere. This was beginning to happen more concretely, exactly because of the power that was conferred to them spontaneously, because the alternative was being, not having that protection meant to die, right? And this is the general trend. Yes, it was the mob. The world was ruled by the mob. And that was what happened before states existed. Because without that, you actually don't have it. It was a normal clienteling system, as all civilizations had up to that point. You have to wait for the 19th century before you have a real absolute state like the one of the Code Napoleon, in an actual public coercive power that goes not really beyond everybody's, right? Just juridically by norm, but a state that effectively can provide for that degree of standardization in the maintenance of peace in arms, right? That before those times didn't quite exist. It was a much more spontaneous business with a large degree of privatization that, generally speaking, didn't really help in a civilizational sense, if not in realizing the necessity of ordering the thing further. And this revolved dramatically always throughout all history around the use of violence, the monopoly of violence. And this is one of the single most overlooked aspects in the history of mankind, in fact. It's not, it's political, it's social, it's economical, man. It's not, it's really about whether I can, cut your head off, right, or not, right? If I want, nobody can stop me, right? That's really what will make you think about that, not how many kilos of grains you can make, right? Because before the grains, you have to think about your freaking head being attached to your torso, right? And that's quite a thing. And chances are that, especially if you want those grains, you have to set those conditions of pacification right immediately, right? The first duty of any civilizational authority is order, right? If you don't have the police that secures the streets, there can't be anything else. It can't be trade, it can't be prosperity, nothing, right? This is something that we have seen countless times everywhere, in every situation, even in much more advanced realities than these, and even in the same Middle Ages. And this, interestingly enough, in fact, caused a reaction among the people. I was saying that the knightly class was just being formed and really taking over, right? It's not before really the second half of the 12th century, even on the battlefields, heavy cavalry was fully decisive, right? In Western Europe, in this post-Carolingian Europe, that's only then that cavalry really dominates completely, and for which the infantry were just, under them, not just militarily, but politically and socially. At this time, even the peasantry actually was pretty damn dangerous. I mean, even the lords that were literally grizzled veterans of military bands, essentially, feared the peasantry. Because, of course, the masses of people are some of the most blindly and deliriously ferocious and violent and uncontrollable one, right? You have to discipline them, in fact, with violence itself, with deterrence, with something that must show them also the the benefit of that in a way. So discipline is not really a personal opinion. And that's why, in fact, there was an enormous deal of cooperation, actually, which favored the same seigneury between the lords and the peasants. It's kind of normal, right? First of all, the lords wouldn't exist if the peasants didn't exist. Also, to debunk any classist bullshit of the fact that, these were kind of hoax or rhyming and prosper communities of tender-hearted peasants that were at heart just the order, the equality. The peasants were freaking bastards, would kill each other, but still today, people shot themselves still in the countryside for bullshit like, what about who broke the fence or something like this. That was the same thing at the time. And the lords, actually, that were, in fact, people experienced in commanding men, right, would show properly in a political, rational sense. We've seen this very often also in the videos about Indo-European religion, the development of chivalry. That is to say, leaders are objectively more intelligent than the others, right? And that's true, even when you see that you have a lame government, but still, that government is the reflection of the people, first of all, and it's still the more rational part of the whole community. Because they are the ones that actually are on the fore when taking matters and how to maintain control, which the average person really doesn't really have a clue how to do, and so you have to compromise also lots of things. And in general, this is exactly what was happening. That war was, especially in the wake of the dramatic demographic and economical development that started in the, it reactivated, especially in the 10th and 11th century. Violence didn't seem much of a viable option for most, successful outcomes. Let's put it in this way. And so there was the thing is severely complicated. This cannot be interpreted in a class sense. This should be explained case by case in the various regions to look at properly what still, in fact, public authority, by the way, was about, because, lay aristocracy was not ecclesiastical aristocracy. They had different prerogatives. They had different interactions, cultures. They were quite similar, actually, in practice. Also, they came from the same families, the same abbots, etc., were militarymen. But still, they played a different game in an institutional level with the kingdom, etc. So there were interests that are not readily evident, at least to somebody who was not really particularly expert in medieval history. But let's say that would naturally bring to some attrition that was not just the mere struggle for survival, but something greater, something that had to do, in fact, exactly with that kind of necessity of order, right? What shape do we want to give to this land? With which other lands should be in cooperation with? What kind of authority should exist in the first place? So, hence what we were saying before, that there was a hierarchy, but still the authority was too weak and the system was still too fluid, right? It's just this cake was cooling off and trying to consolidate around more, sounder powers, principalities would emerge. In fact, we also made videos on single ones of them. We've documented how they formed, etc. Just recently, the video I made on the Duchy of Brittany, or the Duchy of Burgundy, but this was a wide array of individuals. Could be just restless lords. People driven by ambition, by the old religious military cult of millennia old, let's say, that whether it was pagan or Christian, was actually about the same thing. It was about ruling the world. There is a little thing like achieving eternal glory and immortality in heaven for having exterminated your enemies in a holy war, right? And this ideology was tremendously effective, civilizationally speaking, because it did really bring order where the world hadn't known before. And it was just a cultistic idea of themselves. They were dramatically arrogant, self-loathing, egoistic, individualistic, probably some of the most radically violent human types that you can think of in any historical time, that made war just for, in a way, would appear, that's the trick, for the sake of itself, but again, it corresponded to a real aim, a real gain, because they had been grown in a world that had showed them that that was the way of accumulating wealth. Again, if you live in a world where the economy is just that ridiculous surplus, if you want to become rich and powerful, you have to take it from somebody else, and it was always a kind of a good reason to at least think that somebody had insulted you. I mean, again, this is mafia. It's the same exact idea, right? It was about not taking any insults, not appearing less than the other, controlling the hush money, because what's the difference with a tribe? But it's the same thing, right? Local lords would do the same thing that bigger lords would do in the same way. Because they would be unsatisfied of their regional local power. Simply they wanted to become stronger, also to avoid to be taken over by their rivals, by the competitors. So they were ready to war, as we were saying before. It was completely normal. Their entire life was spent on horseback, right? They just, in winter they would spend time with their familia in their moat and Bailey castle. War was made also in winter, telling you truth, sometimes we often overlooked, but generally speaking at this point it was seasonal. You just knew there are chants of these warriors in literature tell literally, spring began, it's the moment, it's the rebirth of all the cycle. You go out where killing and looting and acquiring prestige, etc. In autumn, this varied, right? In I don't know, in northern France, that the field of May was really, because it was kind of colder. In places like Italy, it was March, right? So it was just the season, the world, because again, also the agriculture on base of which everything was, on which everything was based, in fact, was extremely delicate, and even just a few degrees more or less made a big difference in Europe at the same time. It's the same divide that existed at that point, and lords would normally fight against each other, but as we were saying before, also against basically anybody else. That is to say, also against the ecclesiastical lands that traditionally in the post-Carolingian world had enjoyed immunities, so some kind of prosperity that was relatively more sheltered, and had allowed the same ecclesiastical lords to become powerful in their own way. But exactly because of that kind of bit of artificial support, could be in practical terms, when authority wasn't there anymore, kind of more easily, more vulnerable, right? And this was a big deal, because taking arms against the church was sacred, was in many ways what was at the root of the same investiture struggles at some point. There was a debate, a dialogue, relatively to the role of the church in this pacification. The knightly class historically had retained this idea of sacrality, the idea that in the freeman world, among the Europeans, in the Roman, in the Germanic tradition, who bore arms was not just a freeman, but a nobleman. This remained in many mentalities in those areas in Europe, especially where traditionally people were more, capable, in fact, of making their liberties being heard, also against, in fact, feudal authority. That there was something sacred in the faculty of command, in the imperium, that was essentially the faculty of using violence. And as such, there was a sort of sacrality perceived in the arms of the knights, that the church, in fact, also motivated to direct, because it had identified it in the older tradition, so that there was an ancestral intrinsic rivalry between the secular and the ecclesiastical militia, that, however, at some point here, the universal authorities were trying to make cooperate, right, in a sense, to overlap. They would always, was still And so even just these knights wouldn't, by lifestyle, they wouldn't distinguish really anything. There was no such thing at the time like a difference between civilian or military life. We have talked extensively about the mindset of a medieval miles, and what actually had happened to these people to become knights, which again is something that, psychiatrically speaking, like I don't know what I would give to actually meet one of them. In fact, these are not recommendable individuals. They are basically devastatingly traumatized individuals that have been destroyed as human beings and recreated as pure and exclusive killing machines that can cut to pieces literally everybody without any care, right? Except at some point they would break down in tears like children while the bards would sing about their female relatives, their mothers, their sisters that they had left when they were still kids, to go, in fact, being abused and destroyed and rebuilt in the houses, in the retinues of other lords, as it was practiced in this clienterly thing, suffering the most unspeakable psychophysical violence that you can imagine to become what it was needed to be, like a knight, right? And there was there was a passage right. That's what it was, a magical thing. It was considered, I made a video about that, angels who killed everything they touched, as in Parzival, it's literally said. And there is always this inner tension between the greatest good and greatest evil that derives from the responsibility and the burden that these people had, also because they were factually to become the ruling class, right? In this, hierarchical echelons, they were entrusted that degree of imperium that their sword entailed. And they lived just by, again, killing, raiding. That was the entire thing. That's the only thing they did, the only thing they sang, the only thing they prepared themselves for, and the entire community worked basic and exclusively for them to exist in that function, because again, it wasn't basically anything else. I mean, feudalism was just the entire community working to provide for the weapons, the armor, the war horses, and the enormous amount of supplies needed to maintain them, and trained, together with the knight, of course, for the intensive long life training that these men underwent in general, right? This was the moment in which, of course, the collective one was, as always, the most dramatic, important thing. The thickly packed, heavy cavalry charges that were to smash literally everything was in between. Like, at the time, there weren't tanks, there weren't helicopters, anything. The worst thing that could happen to you is to have a band of these guys going at you, and you wouldn't really have much to defend yourself, in open field against them. And without ever ignoring, again, the contribution of the infantry, that was very often, again, as vicious, is not properly, they were considered subhuman beings by a certain standard, because, of course, the hierarchy was evident. The imperium of a knight was over-exceeding comparing to the imperium of a famulus. It may have been a free man, but if he wasn't, he was just a serf, so he was just an object. And maybe he would even have a better life than a freeman under the in the boss retinue. But it would also have to do something that was putting their life at stake basically in everything they did. Again, they killed each other on a regular basis. And definitely this mobsterism, even as a way of life, wasn't kind of the best for putting order from the top at the same time. I mean, just as the local milas thought that the serfs, the peasants, were a bunch of cowards, rabbits, and non-humans, that they even had essentially a racial contempt towards them. There was still also this idea, again, of the conquerors of the earlier times that come to rule these pre-existing populations, all the celestial, agrarian, chthonic opposition. It was an ideology, right? This didn't have to do strictly with race, but also, right, they thought it in that way. It was terrible. It was something appallingly violent and ruthless without any possibility of escape. But so a king or an emperor would see this lesser milites as nothing, right? So if these people kept making mess because they thought that their land was just their own business, and they wouldn't cut it with violence, etc., they would simply exterminate them. I mean, if they could, right? And the same thing that, I don't know, even just the Carolingians had done towards the Saxons, towards any other people who would just bother them and wouldn't be capable of even of achieving their greatness and deserved just to be subjugated. And the proof was the one of arms. So that's why, by the way, at this time the military class was so fluid, because literally if you were, like by the 15th century, you were a knight just effectively if you were, there was always some kind of social promotion, but the heaviest one, the most powerful one, were noblemen, people that really were, part of a crystallized hierarchy. At this time, if you just had the luck of, finding a sword and knowing how to fight on horseback, where in another, even just as part of this regiments, etc., you could become a knight yourself, or even more. Maybe your descendants to become viscounts, and then maybe counts, and then maybe full nobility at some point. It did happen. It happened for many, also of the most noble lineages in Europe to date. There were many knights, and there were nothing better than brigands, as you understand. Also, there was this dramatic effort for the process of concentration of power to tendentially exclude the second-born sons from inheriting the entire father's, in fact, fortune, which was the tumor essentially that had killed even the Carolingian Empire. I mean, this fact that they had to split equally everything from son to son. That, of course, the other sons said, but why is that guy? Maybe he's even worse than us. That had, just because he was born first, has to acquire everything. But at the same time, this would bring to the disintegration of the public order in a way. So all these cadets, as you know, were famous for their bravados, for their violence. Many people say the Crusades were created essentially to get them out of the way, to go die in the Holy Land. Well, in part it is also true. I think it's a bit more complicated, but yeah, definitely it was. These people would just roam around, even from country to country. Right? It was a time where, especially the Western tactics and military culture was quite praised by other peoples, as you know. At this point, the Normans or other people, even from Western Europe, were hired by other states, even those that were forming, incidentally. How many English, French, Spanish, Italians, Germans, especially the Hungarians settled in Hungary to check the ethnic oligarchy, to create a functional monarchy in the land. How many Normans scattered everywhere up to the Caspian Sea or in the Middle East you could find as mercenaries, just making their life. It was a life like another, right? It was not probably like it was probably more dangerous than a peasant's life, but it was, at least it had more perspective for remuneration, and given that exalted ideology that was at the root of civilization at that point, it's better to dare in that way and to go out there searching for fortune, becoming a militaryman, than just remaining in that stinky place for the rest of your life, blowing the land. Right? It's kind of it's also understandable, as also the peasant choice is understandable by some other standards. And in any case, there was some kind of order, of course, provided, as we've seen, by the lords of the various fortresses that could mutuate, could kind of coerce part of these individuals under their seigneury, who in turn integrated the scarce revenues of their lands acquired from, as a laudia or beneficia, or simply having occupied them, because that's also how a beneficium could happen, right? The king would recognize your authority on lands that maybe you had stolen and massacred everybody who lived in there, but simply, you were the land that, in the political game, you were useful for the king at that point. That would start a customary right on those lands for your lineage, right? And these lords would use such revenues also to, in part to just to attract knights in their bands, in their masnate, as they were called. Probably that's a Romance term, so it derives from the fact possibly that they were just paid in bread, right? Just to have literally something to eat. That's where lone wolves scattered. It's not very far from the older berserker thing, mentally speaking, right? Literally, people habituated to live in the wilderness, because who are you if you're a brigand? If you roam around, you're just like that. That toughens you up. Well, the effort of the lords was to have enough of these warriors to wage periodical, as we've seen, seasonal raids on the vineyards or cultivated fields of far away and closer localities, raiding livestock, expoliating the merchants, by the way. And in some areas, of course, this was, if you were capable, if you were a charismatic leader, you knew how to inspire respect and terror and discipline, etc., and you knew how to coordinate your men, you knew how to fight, etc., you could score important success in military speaking. It was always a gamble. These people had a ridiculous life expectancy exactly because of this, in spite of all, the other, let's say, health reasons you can imagine, the medicine of the time, nutrition of the time. But let's say it would be a start, right? Literally, our civilization also rests on the fact that these people began to concentrate power with these means on these grounds. And this happened in many other times in history, by the way. But the sheer brutality of these activities sometimes was too much, right? Once, you had, this is what with the mob itself, normally the mob exists in places that are kind of underdeveloped, they're poor or something. And so then eventually when they become rich, even through the worst activities, they kind of gentrify it, civilize. They invest in clean business. There are still those who don't, and that are taken out, paradoxically, by the same gentrified criminals, right? And as we've seen, this was true from the top powers to the lower ones. So what actually happened is that from the end of the 10th and during the course of the 11th century, especially in the kingdoms of France and Burgundy, Western Francia and the kingdom of Arles, Burgundy, that were the most feudal in nature, in fact, compared to Eastern Francia or the Italic kingdom. That movement, that development of the movement, in fact, of the so-called peace, or pieces, at plural if you want, peace of God, that were promoted mostly, but not entirely, by some bishop or abbot or pious prince, or even by peasant protests that express themselves as reunions and pacification of knights and lay lords and also ecclesiastical ones in front of the people and the clergy. How? Essentially with oaths on the Bible, on the sanctioning actually minutely detailed promises to respect mostly the churches and their possessions, the incolumity of the clergy, of the monks, especially if they were defenseless, which it was not necessarily the case, especially for the clergy, and the integrity of their property, banally, under the threat of excommunication, ecclesiastically speaking, and even, of course, of violent reprisals from sides of more or less improvised bands of family of the same churches or just common people. The peace of God it's very interesting, as you understand, because so first of all, why the church, right? It was not just a competition with the military class. It's properly the idea that the same lords are carrying out, the lay lords, are carrying out at this time in history a very clever patrimonial strategy that had been started, since ever Christianity was there. As we were saying before, to invest, to donate, to essentially ecclesiastical property, to as an asset, because these properties would have an immunity as ecclesiastical possessions that, however, the family in this sense lost formally, because they were not secular possessions anymore, they belonged to the church, but that they would virtually and factually command, because they would simply put their own cadet sons or their daughters as respectively bishops or abbots and abbesses to rule the place on behalf of their family. And the interesting thing about that is that, unlike the family that had these lineage problems of inheritance, when a bishop or an abbot dies, you just replace it with somebody else. Of course, at this time, bishops, abbots had children. They would actually, yes, pass it sometimes also in inheritance like that, but it was never formalized because for canon law you couldn't do it. So you could do it, but not because like there was properly a right being defined in these exact centuries. You think about 1037, the Edictum de Beneficiis, that sanctioned the inheritance properly of all even the lesser fiefs, right? The larger ones were already during the sanction as such during the late Carolingian era, and so legitimately the most powerful noble families that could afford, by the way, to endow these rich monasteries and abbeys, etc., would say to those who would infest their lands, etc., no, you cannot touch that, right? Because that's also our property. And so the church, even in general, would, right? The church as a broader institution and with all the episcopal clergy, etc., that was also sometimes even in contrast with the secular one, but normally cooperatively speaking, especially as much as they were elites in general, they could have the most ferocious attritions, but still kind of being solidal towards the lower, echelons of the populace. And the way they would operate was also this Christian idea of concord, of love, of forgiveness, and so making leverage literally also on the misery of that world that was, as we've seen, a pretty sorrowful reality. And so let's say, what do we kill each other for all the time? Let's come together, let's be friends, let's love each other again. So what they would do is that at some point the peace of God was essentially, bringing all these, again, mobsters together, say, forgive each other. And they would do this publicly, because that was essentially in a barely literate world, the only way to sanction, like people said, all it took was to have the witnesses that could testify in a trial, saying those guys kind of swore not to fight anymore. There was, of course, as we've seen, this quite specific settlement also over the issues for which they were fighting. They very often were kind of very complicated, right? The reasons why they would claim, I don't know, this land is mine, it's mine. It was not really a light thing, because yes, there were just ratios of power that would conflict in that way, but sometimes in this unregulated reality without a clear authority or ultimate legal assertion, in fact, of royal justice, imperial justice, nobody could even, but in their mind, they would just see the thing like, I'm powerful just by military religious tradition, I must own that place. Right? It's that sense of individualistic, egoistic, warrioristic mindset that says, I'm better than anybody else, and I can't take an affront from everybody. And these centuries instead, we're seeing also the important development of local justice, the gradual reaffirmation of monarchies, of public orders, and so of the rule of the law, which was a big deal. And the same public authority, often subcontracted to these lords when they were at the head, of fiefs, etc., would receive all the judicial rights that were extremely remunerative, by the way, because they were about the most important causes that entailed very important assets to be discussed in the property and so on. And in front of the people, in front of the clergy. So all of this was given a kind of a sacred nature. The oath was, in fact, on the Bible. There was the same idea that as a knight was invested by the church, in many ways, this peace was sacred, and that's hence the peace of God. And so something that was more important than just, let's put an end to violence simply like that, but let's think that there is a higher order that must be enforced and that takes everybody's effort and will in order to succeed in this direction. As we've seen, the same clergy was pretty violent. Some bishops were just war-bent leaders themselves, and so they would do the worst things. And in fact, there were cases, in fact, of the same bishops fighting against each other in this situation. And there, the ecclesiastical hierarchy was quite important, could take even important proportions. It was, it was typical, even much earlier times, like, where's the border of the diocese historically? What does pertain to this and that, especially on seigniories that, let's remember, do not actually extend, like you could draw them on a map. You could simply say, this is the border. Sometimes a seigniory overlapped different districts. It was a very complicated thing, even just to determine, legally speaking. And so we have splendid inquiries from the most civilly functional polities in Europe at the time. It really show us, like, that there was an extensive, even police and investigative activity at the time. It was utterly extraordinary. It shows you that this world that people today do not give a damn about, they don't even know they existed. I mean, the idea of a post-Carolingian reality. An entire universe existed for nobody eventually to care about today. And naturally there were some fines applied. There was at stake, in fact, even sometimes the same private properties, the same assets. It was all about preserving that property, preserving that stability. Right, the Ecclesiastical Excommunication happened. We made a couple of videos about bloodshed and penitence in early medieval Europe that explains how also properly killing, spilling blood was in fact always a sin. It was actually, even in this relatively unruly world, in fact you don't have to be fooled, as we were saying before, a great regulation and great care for. Like, it would surprise you of how somebody who, again, could kill literally everybody if ordered, or even if just he wanted, would still consider that a sin. Because people still had those values that were all intertwined with this broader mystics. Because again, you could not be overly exalted in that fashion we were talking about before if you didn't even acknowledge the importance of reason, justice, etc. I mean, this was part of the cultures that had always existed in Europe. It's the wisdom that prevails over strength in the Indo-European religion. You don't have just to be violent and strong. Those are the giants, the chthonic, subhuman forces that the celestial heroes actually subjugate, because they're more intelligent, even when they're not strong physically as them. This was the principle, right? So it was a very important. It was a psychomachia, as they would call it. It was a struggle of the soul. That's why justice was so important. People would actually listen to it because it was basically the only moral code that existed for make things work. I mean, like today, still are for humans always. But in fact, in the absence of an order, in the presence of, in fact, somebody who breaks the law, people have to take matters in their own hand. They don't just have to wait for the higher authority. And so that's also how things happened. Why? It was a constant definition, reciprocal definition. And as we were saying before, there were simply also more concrete reasons. That is, not just the enlightened mind, I don't know, the local bishop saying, okay, guys, stop this, cut it out, make peace. No, there were lots of people that were very seriously pissed off with this world violence. I mean, especially if you were a peasant who had broken his back for entire years on a field, and you would see your entire vineyard destroyed by these war bands that just passed one day, destroying the work of, maybe even of generations of your family. So at that point, the peasants would go en masse to knock at the door of the Motte and Bailey castle of the Lord, pretty angry, and sometimes the lords were defeated. The peasants this is what is dramatically overlooked, that in these centuries up to the 13th, the peasants were actually a strong force in feudal Europe. They were radically violent. Again, they were not the poor martyrs of the situation. They were often they were the next door bullies. They were extremely violent, especially en masse. They would exalt themselves in the same way, would go out there exterminating, destroying. They wouldn't see anything, right? The knights actually, even in their own mental brutality, were much more logical, rational, coherent people than them. So the peasants were actually scary. And the same churches had all these serfs that could be armed, and they would be armed, even at the order of the church, to go there, make a freaking mess. The simple commoners would start being pretty angry. The same merchants, they had their own money, they had their own mob, they had their own clienteles. So that's where the violence also stemmed from. But it was a violence, again, always exercised to put order, for a criterion. And rarely, actually, this had a long-lasting effect. But the point is that there couldn't be a long-lasting effect in a world that is, in a Europe that is fragmented in thousands of seigniories. It's literally an unpredictable system, as life in general, and still the world today. The important, though, was the momentary relief, and a real relief, even if provisional one, in fact, of the pains of the population, which was really important, because again, in a world where literally you starve to death just if a single harvest goes wrong, and it would just go wrong for natural accidents or whatever, again, somebody destroying it on purpose is really something you want to avoid, and you're going to take up arms, because, at that point it's either starving to death or being disemboweled by a knight. Choose it. Which one do you prefer? So there were also the Truces of God, which were something different. Like the peace had to be ideally more definitive, as you understand, but it came before, because the Pax was the Friede. This is interesting because this pacificational means existed in the previous world. I mean, the Pax Romana is the same concept. The Germanic Friede is the same concept. They went on. The Germanic Friede, for example, in the Holy Roman Empire was notoriously institutionalized. The Swiss Confederacy was born because essentially the local peasants called for a Friede. It was a Landfried, which was technically a public prerogative, but in that state of collapse of post-Hohenstaufen reality, even the peasants could take over privately. And exactly because of that, because you understand that the public authority had collapsed, that's yet another moment where this happened. So the Truce of God instead was like a suspension of the armed hostilities among lords on certain days of the week and of the year, especially on Sunday, in the honor of God and in remembrance of the suffering of the Christ. This is particularly important because, especially in the Frankish world, as we've seen, these things were common mostly in France, in Burgundy. the Merovingian legacy, still at that point, was, as you know, based on an hematophiliac cultural identity. I mean, literally, the Franks, ever since the beginnings, were obsessed with blood. We know that even when they were fully Christianized in the 7th century, the Pope complained they still made human sacrifices. And I made a video about the desacralization of the Merovingian monarchy that talked about the hymns to God of Christ, the Passion. And the Merovingians were obsessed with these readings of the Passion and the blood, and they insisted, they overtly emphasized this, because they were extremely warlike people. And they saw blood in this, again, these are standard human beings. So again, these are not bots. If you expose them to radical, unspeakable, unthinkable violence, there is something in their brains that is happening, right? In their mindset that requires this justification for it. And so they have to connect the whole warlike attitude still to some idea of repentance, which is necessary, mentally speaking, to not just to become insane, right? Because if you follow just the military pagan ideal, basically every time you make a mistake, you should kill yourself, because you are imperfect and so you can't be saved. Instead, Christianity in this sense helped also to cope with these real mental cases in a more civilized context that helped them also this idea, okay, if you really can't stop killing each other, at least don't do it on Sunday, all right? Think about Christ that died for your sins, which is literally the point, you see. And also some other holidays of the Christian calendar. And it would be respected, and it would become kind of, it was not much about, the situation was a mess anyway, but it was a first step to say, okay, let's at least agree on the fact that there is a higher order and that we should try to stick to that ideal. This ideal is also the chivalric one, is also the one that already existed since Indo-European times, the code of conduct, etc. And it was just being better defined at the better definition, in fact, of the political institutional authorities that existed out there, while Europe was gradually recompacting politically to discipline, in fact, and to pacify these places. So that, again, wars actually were becoming ever more destructive, but at least they were ever more channeled and concentrated in some directions, so that at least larger parts of the population would be spared from that. It could produce more for fueling outer expansion, pacification. Hence the Crusades, hence the emergence of the feudal monarchies, and all this stuff. And again, this is a civilizational tool, because we still rest on the basis laid by these people. So such suspension of violence demonstrate, when they were respected, how the really numerous seigneurial wars were still conducted for all the 11th century, and often also beyond that, in a sort of empirical way. I mean, you couldn't really decide where to make war, right? They would activate immediately as operations of sudden violence, because, again, it was so complicated to predict anything that it was just a gamble, and one that you wouldn't have sometimes even the embarrassment of justifying, because it was so common that you would say, okay, let's do this, right? Because any time is good as another. And that's the idea that also laid at the base of this thing. This violence could be interrupted, but it could be resumed frequently, so that even all those pieces of God, the Truces of God, it would happen. This went on for a long time. These pacifications are to be found throughout all history in a way. They would arrive at the church where they had been baptized, maybe in common. They would hug and kiss each other in front of in the church, in front of all the people, the clergy, and everybody. Oh yes, we will not. They would cry. We are so repentant. Then maybe the next day they kill each other. So again, this may seem weird, schizophrenic, whatever, but if you actually look at especially the ecclesiastical narrative was somewhat biased, but it's obvious. I mean, like the same military narrative would have been biased. But again, if you look at that in a more comprehensive fashion, you realize that still there were reasons that It's not about justifying them, but you kind of understand why they would kill each other, because there was so much at stake that, yeah, that was one of the cases in which probably in some, maybe in the minority of the cases, but, fighting was kind of the better option. And the one that would sadly fuel itself, also, yes, emotionally speaking, but really not so much as we think. Actually, these people were much more in control of themselves, also because, as we've seen, they were literally destroyed and recreated in order to function like that than not. These people could have not handled that world in all its brutality if they had just been emotionalistic about it. They had a moral strength that the average individual today doesn't even know, what it could possibly even remotely feel like. And so we should be understanding of these mechanisms when, in fact, we when we don't know even often by the sources, because this is not a dramatically documented period, why they happened. We can imagine that. Were not good reasons, but in a moral sense, but at least they might have been rational reasons in a practical sense. And we too often underestimate that aspect of reality. And one factor that can help to understand it is that there was no chance to elaborate plans of annihilation of the enemy forces. Like, you would always fight with your neighbors because they were the rival clan, right? And again, it's as if, you would take out one of theirs and then the feud started. Consider that this was a world based where the feud was an actual juridical institution to recompose the society, right? So even judicial duel, etc., they were not the best civilization, but as long as the world was kind of like that and there was not a better system to regulate the whole thing, well, people would make justice by themselves. So again, the peace of God and truce of God actually shows when there was a higher power was emerging and capable of forcing those who weren't as developed to be brought under some sounder discipline, right? But again, this could not happen if somebody had not known how to make war themselves and had not risen through the ranks like that, which is basically all what we understand about humanity still today in the faculty of commander, personal responsibility, and all this stuff. In any case, for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.